Hello and welcome to the Kubernetes Case Files Commentary. I'm your host, Glen Simon, and I'm joined by my colleague, Myles Gray. The Kubernetes Case Files is a kind of a more entertaining way to talk about app modernization in the context of this fictional detective story. The story plays out in a series of episodes, and we're on episode number 4. In this episode, we're talking about this idea of old school development, right? The detective interrogates someone known as old school, who is probably a developer who is mired in sort of old school ways of development. Last time we talked about monolithic apps, right? Certainly a common way of developing apps over the past, I don't know, decade or so. And when we think about modern apps, modern apps, how might they differ, Myles, from monolithic apps?
So modern apps are different in a couple of ways. The first one of which is probably indicated by the name is we don't really call them monolithic apps anymore. So that generally means that if something was mono before, it's not now, which means they're split up into smaller pieces. So you might have heard of this called microservices, and that sort of development paradigm. And I'll give you an example of what a microservice might be. So say, for example, we're talking about our legacy bank web portal. Currently, it's a monolith, right? So all the functionality is in this one monolithic project. What it might be, if it was a modern app, just as an example, your actual, say your checking accounts, right? That's one microservice. Your credit cards, it's another microservice. The help desk type functionality, that's another microservice. So you take the customer facing delineations, if you want, these different services. And that's where you sort of draw these logical boundaries between things. And the reason you want to do that, and this is one of the paradigms of microservices, is if you split out functionality and you make a project, composed of lots of smaller parts rather than one big part, that means that you can have one team focus on one part of that project specifically. So say you've got one team and they do the credit card stuff, and another team and they do the checking account things. That means if they want to make a change to their individual piece, they can, and they can roll it out without having to consult the other teams. Generally, they will in practice anyway, but the idea is it means that if you want to make changes to your own service, you have to do less bureaucracy, less consultative work with other teams because you've got well-defined contracts between each other. Now, along with this, though it's not strictly necessary, is containers, because containers are a new technology that's come along in the same sort of timeline as microservices. And it lends itself very nicely to having those individual services packaged up and deployed independently. So that's why you might start to hear, microservices and containers and Kubernetes all mixed together in the same conversation. They mean different things, but they're used together.
Okay, so really it sounds like that if we want to kind of move in this direction from a modern app development standpoint, we need maybe we need some infrastructure, maybe a kind of maybe a platform, like a Kubernetes. You mentioned Kubernetes platform to do that. I believe these types of platforms probably exist in the public cloud, and you can also build them on-prem. What would be maybe some of the pros and cons of going with an on-prem, or building one for on-prem, or just using something in the public cloud?
Right. And I'd just like to sort of preface it with that if you are using Kubernetes as your modern app runtime, there are other ways to do it. But if you choose Kubernetes, the idea behind Kubernetes is it creates like a generic layer on top of which the application runs. So that means if you build it kind of like Java years ago, right? Write once, run anywhere. Kubernetes is the same kind of thing where you package once and you run anywhere. And that means, public cloud or on-prem or whatever. So there are obviously, different considerations, whether you want to run on-prem or you want to run in public cloud. Do you use the native Kubernetes offering from a public cloud, or do you have, a third-party one that you put on top of there? And you might wonder, well, if it's all Kubernetes, why would I do that? And the fact of the matter is that while Kubernetes tries to be this abstraction layer between all of the infrastructure, each cloud platform has their opinions about how things should be implemented and how things should be used, which means that there are more and more customizations that you have to do for each cloud. So if you use one from a third-party vendor, then that means that you have the same runtime across all of your clouds. So you've got that sort of, build once, run anywhere type of thing going on.
Right. And so, yeah, especially if you're, an enterprise, which Legacy Bank is obviously an enterprise, they're probably using public clouds as well as on-prem. They have a mix.
Right.
And so if they're building these, these key mission critical applications, it's very possible they may need to or want to run them in a variety of places for either, I don't know, scalability or uptime requirements or any other thing like that. Okay, well, that makes sense. Well, okay, I think that wraps up this episode. Thank you, Myles. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this episode of the Kubernetes Case Files commentary. Look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.